Hello, good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here at Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart and this evening in a very packed programme we are, as always, very delighted to have a guest with us, and it is Ian Blackford MP, formerly the leader of the SNP in Westminster, but more importantly currently the MP for Ross, Skye and Lochaber, a part of Scotland that most of us always want to go and visit because of its beauty. But Ian, delighted to have you and welcome to the programme.
Thanks, Donald. It's a pleasure to be on with you. I'm blessed actually this week that we're in recess in Westminster, and somewhat unusually I'm actually at home, and the weather's rather lively to say the least up in the Highlands at the moment. I guess it is everywhere, but nonetheless there's still a beauty, and the darkness is just about to fall. But as I look out and I see the beauty of the landscape overlooking the loch, looking over Loch Nizer towards Uig. It's a beautiful place, and I would certainly encourage our friends that are listening and watching the programme to come and spend time in the most beautiful part of Scotland.
Indeed, and unfortunately we go from beauty off to the beast as we start off this evening, as we always do, with the Ukrainian update on day 580 of the illegal Russian attempt to invade the sovereign country of Ukraine. And in common with every other week, there are a number of new names in here. So before I begin, my apologies for my pronunciation if I don't quite hit the mark. Today, Russia's Defence Ministry released video footage showing Viktor Sokolov, the commander of the Black Sea Fleet, taking part in a video conference with the Defence Minister Sergei Shoigu, a day after Ukraine claimed that Sokolov was killed in an attack on Russia's Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol. On Monday, Ukrainian Special Forces said they had killed Sokolov along with 33 other officers in a missile attack. An overnight Russian airstrike on the key Ukrainian grain exporting port of Ishmael injured 2 people and damaged infrastructure, the governor of the Odessa region said today. The Ukrainian military has reported shooting down 26 of the 38 Iranian-made attack drones it said were launched by Russia. Natalia Homeniuk, spokesperson for Ukraine's military in the south, has said that the Orlivka-Asachia border crossing point between Ukraine and Romania is closed due to the overnight Russian drone attack. Ukrainian MP Kira Rudik has called for an urgent upgrade in the air defence around Odessa after repeated Russian attacks. Regional authorities have stated that 2 people were injured in a Russian attack on Kherson earlier this morning. Another Russian missile strike today damaged a local enterprise in the southern Ukrainian city of Kryvyi Rih, its mayor Alexander Vikul said. TASS reports that 7 settlements in the Kursk region have lost power after a Ukrainian drone dropped explosives onto an electricity substation. A cargo vessel left a Ukrainian Black Sea port today. Kyiv has tried to establish a temporary humanitarian corridor hugging the coastline, and 2 bulk carriers left at the port of Chernomorsk last week using it. In July, the UN and Turkey brokered a deal which allowed Ukraine to export grain, which collapsed after Russia withdrew. Polish experts have confirmed that the missile that killed 2 people at a grain facility in southern Poland in November was fired by Ukraine. This is according to a Polish newspaper. The explosion of the missile in NATO member Poland fueled fears that the war in Ukraine could spiral into a wider conflict by triggering the alliance's mutual defence clause. But at the time, Warsaw and NATO said that they believed that it was a Ukrainian stray, easing worries about the escalation. Belarus leader Alexander Lukashenko said that on the 15th of October he will meet in Kyrgyzstan with Vladimir Putin. And fragments of a missile were found in a village in Moldova's breakaway Transnistria region on Monday after a major Russian aerial attack on neighbouring Ukraine overnight, regional authorities said. The Moscow-backed Transnistria region broke away in a brief civil conflict after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is not, however, recognised internationally. And a UN investigation into human rights violations in Ukraine since Russia's invasions warned that evidence indicates the use of torture by Russian forces has been both widespread and systematic. Ian, one of the things that we've always been concerned about in Ukraine and the conflict there is the widening of it. And I noticed in the last week or so that the Poles and the Ukrainians have been a little splintered, but that doesn't seem to have affected the rest of the West and the rest of us wanting to support the Ukrainians.
Yeah, and I think, when you think about the countries that border Russia, border Ukraine, you think about the Baltic states, for example, I think there's genuine concern about the Russian state, what has happened, and potential threats that there are to all of them as well. I think it's really important that all of us in the West support Ukraine in the struggles that they're going through. I was actually speaking to some Scottish people today that are engaged in humanitarian relief, and I think it is important that we continue to talk about Ukraine, that we showcase what's going on, and I would applaud yourselves for the focus of attention that you're giving to this. And you put yourself in the eyes and the hands of those that are in Ukraine, those that are on the front line. And let's remember that the conflict started, of course, in 2014, but the conflict at the level that we're seeing now was ignited in February last year. It's gone on a long time. The number of casualties that the Ukrainians have taken, the injuries that people have suffered from, the need to get medical support and for people to be rehabilitated, it's exerting a tremendous toll and all of them. And I think it is important that we continue to keep the focus on Ukraine. I think it's really important that people in Scotland are engaging positively in that humanitarian efforts. We need to make sure that we are getting support to people in Ukraine, and I suspect that this is something which is going to be with us for a long period to come. But it's when we're fighting for independence for Scotland and our right to be a sovereign independent country, it is right in a situation like this that we support the sovereignty, the integrity of the sovereignty of Ukraine at a time like this, and we stand with the people there that are facing so much.
Indeed, and we go from the conflict in Ukraine to something closer to home, as the BMJ has said that the UK cost of living crisis will cause thousands of premature deaths. Millions of people in the UK have been hit hard with levels of inflation not seen since the 1970s as a result of the war in Ukraine, COVID, Brexit and UK government economic policy. Poorer households have borne the brunt as they spend a larger proportion of their income in energy, the cost of which has soared. And now a new study has found that the cost of living crisis will probably cause thousands of premature deaths in the UK and significantly widen the wealth and health gap between the richest and poorest. The new modelling study suggests premature deaths, people dying before they reach 75, will rise 6.5% this year due to the cost of living crisis, with 30 extra deaths per 100,000 people. The findings were published in the journal BMJ Public Health. The study focused in Scotland, but the researchers from Public Health Scotland and the University of Glasgow said that similar effects are likely across the UK as we have modelled the impact of UK government measures. The predicted increase in premature deaths from a baseline of 463 per 100,000 to 493 people per 100,000 equates to thousands of extra deaths a year in the UK. Evidence shows low income is associated with poorer health, and that falls in income adversely affecting health. The researchers wanted to assess the potential impact of the inflation on death rates this year with and without mitigating measures. They used scenario modelling to estimate how recent high inflation would affect household incomes, how mitigation measures would modify these effects, and how death rates, life expectancy and inequalities would change as a result. In every scenario modelled, households in the most deprived areas were the hardest hit in relative terms, even with government support, and will be £1,400 worse off in 2022-23, according to the study. Without any mitigation, inflation will increase premature deaths by 5% in the least deprived areas and by 23% in the most deprived, according to the study. The EPG scenario would lower these to between 3 and 16%, and the addition of the cost of living support would cut these to between 2 and 8%. Commenting, the SNP Social Justice spokesperson David Linden MP said this report lays bare the human cost of Westminster's economic and social recklessness. The consequences outlined in this report of the Tories' mini-budget, a hardline Brexit which Labour supports, and 13 years of brutal austerity should send shockwaves through Westminster. Westminster created the cost of living crisis, but it is households and working families in Scotland who are paying the price. Ian, it's often that you read the Daily Mail headlines, you hear this, that and the other that's happening in terms of policy within the Conservative Party or within Westminster, and the government and the Labour Party falling in line behind. But the truth and reality of many of these things is the appalling effect that it has on ordinary people in ordinary days that they're having to try and get by with, which is increasingly devastating because of the ineptitude of some of the political leaders down in Westminster.
Yes, of course, and I have to say, sadly, these are political choices. If you go back, Donald, to the financial crisis that we had in 2008, we had a massive quantitative easing programme. Now, I'm not saying that was necessarily the wrong thing to do. I think at the time it started, it was probably necessary. But at the real root of this, right since then, has been a disconnect between monetary and fiscal policy. And the poorest have had to pay the brunt of the cost of that. Now, what I mean by that, with quantitative easing, and of course that accelerated right through the COVID period, we injected cash capital into the financial system that drove up asset prices. Those with assets, those with stocks and shares, those that own property, did very well out of that. I can actually remember the day that the quantitative easing programme started. It was the 19th of March 2009. It was the day that the FTSE 100 troughed, and it rose quite substantially since then. And what government should have done was recognise that you needed to have a fiscal stimulus that would have created the ingredients for demand for growth, that would have led to investment in the real economy, that would have driven up productivity, that would have driven up wages, driven up living standards. But we had the reverse, because what we've had from the Tories over that last period that they've been in government for since 2010 is austerity. And I remember when the SNP group went from 6 to 56, the first piece of legislation that we faced in Parliament was the attack on working tax credits. And it's that lack of compassion, that lack of decency and comprehension, that when you take cash out the pockets of the poorest, not only do you restrain the growth of the economy, but you punish people that need support. And it's a damning indictment of everything that's happened, that BMJ report. And when we all know the statistics, we can see them. The fact that life expectancy is decreasing, but even within the bold numbers, it's about that range of life expectancy, the difference, if you like, between the east of Glasgow and Eastwood. It's markedly different. And I remember in that period in Parliament as well, you'll recall that we had the Cridland review that was about increasing the pensionable age. And I don't blame Cridland for anything that happened. He was doing a job. But I remember going to see him and asking the question about what analysis that DWP had done on the differential between life expectancy and healthy life expectancy. And Donald, it wasn't part of the equation. And the answer I got was because any data on healthy life expectancy would be the responsibility of the health department, not DWP. It's stunning that they're taking decisions that have a fundamental impact on people's livelihoods, and they quite simply don't do the job. Now, I suspect you're probably of a similar generation to myself, and if you go back to the 1970s, you may remember David Player in his report called Born to Fail. So there's nothing new in the challenges that we face, and the fact that poverty is becoming intergenerational. And I look at my good friend Nicola Sturgeon and the job that Humza's now doing, and the responsibility that the Scottish Government's taken with, for example, the child payment to mitigate some of the problems that we see on the front line, when fortunately we don't have the powers to do everything. But we all pay a price because this is a social cost, and it should damn all of us that people are not living full and healthy lives. as a direct consequence of the political choices that people are making. And let's not forget, of course, we face a cost of living crisis, we face a stagnant economy, but this is a very wealthy society. And it's about that responsibility that all of us should have for our fellow man. There is a phrase, and I think it's right that I use it tonight, that society is only as strong as its weakest link. But the simple fact is we're allowing people to drown in poverty. And it's absolutely shameful that in a modern and a civilised and a wealthy society that we face these challenges, these problems to the extent that we do.
Indeed, and one of the interesting things I think there in terms of the options that people have with the sort of flip-flapping of the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party, I've said this many a time in this programme, that I often want to see what the Labour Party are going to do. And what I just do is look at yesterday's newspaper and see what the Conservative Party had said, and lo and behold, what's coming along is, and it's almost like there's no alternative down in Westminster apart from the SNP, Plaid Cymru, Greens with their one MP and so on. And it just seems a very discordant difference, divergence between two nations.
Yeah, yes, it does. And of course, I think what's going on with Keir Starmer and those round about him is don't frighten the horses. They're trying to secure people that voted Tory in the last election, and I feel sorry for the decent people in the Labour Party in other parts of the United Kingdom. There are many decent people there because they don't like this any more than we do, but they're hamstrung by a leadership that, quite frankly, aren't questioning why they want to be in power. If you want to be in power, you need to do that because you want to make a difference to people's lives, not deliver Tory light. And that's, in essence, what is happening with Keir Starmer today. And again, I don't blame those that have perhaps flirted with voting Labour over the course of the last few months, but we need to say to them, we need to have that conversation about the type of society that we want to live in. Can I take that on a wee bit, if I may, as well, Donald, because I think
Yes.
it's important. That I mean, I stress the fact that we haven't had economic growth because of the wrong choices. And what we really need to do is we need to inspire people as to what Scotland can do. You know, I know we're going to talk probably later on about the environmental challenges, but we've actually got enormous opportunity through green energy and driving investment into our country, driving up skill levels, driving up wages, creating the wealth that allow us to have the social services that we aspire to. And it's about that partnership, that recognition that we want economic growth for a purpose, and that purpose is delivering a fairer society. And if we accept that responsibility of delivering hope to people, then I'm utterly convinced we will take people with us. But my goodness, what a difference to the message that the Labour Party are delivering today.
Indeed, we go to question not only what type of society in terms of the economy and social policy, but also today a court hearing on secret UK government and attitudes to the union polling was held today, a long-running legal battle between the SNP MP Tommy Shepherd and the Cabinet Office over the public release of secret UK government information on attitudes to the union is being considered by an upper tribunal judge in a hearing. The data under dispute relates to taxpayer-funded polling on attitudes towards the union conducted by the UK government between January 2018 and June 2019. Mr Shepherd's request was initially rejected by the Cabinet Office in 2019, and it cited section 35(1)(a) of the Freedom of Information Act, which states that information does not need to be released to the public, and I quote, if it relates to the formulation or development of government policy. After taking it to the Information Commissioner, Shepherd won on appeal in the First Tier Tribunal, the first judicial decision-making body for freedom of information claims. The First Tier Tribunal ruled that the information requested by the SNP Scotland and its Constitution spokesperson, and I quote, relates to the implementation of existing policy rather than to policy development. And as a result, the Cabinet Office were ordered to disclose the information. The British government is now seeking to overturn that decision in a legal challenge at the upper tribunal after being granted the right to appeal in June just of last year. If successful, Shepherd says that it would set a nightmare precedent which would allow the government to avoid freedom of information requests on any aspect of its activity simply by stating that it is developing policy in that area. Commenting, Tommy Shepherd MP said, "What the Cabinet Office are arguing should ring alarm bells with anyone who values the right to freedom of information. Their case is based on the misconception that they have a sweeping exemption under Section 35 of the Freedom of Information Act, extending the clause way beyond its identified purpose. If successful, a ruling in their favour could create a nightmare precedent and give them a licence for secrecy. The Tories would cite it every time they attempt to cover up their wrongdoings for years to come." Does anyone really believe that the Tories are seeking to change their policy as it relates to independence or the union between Scotland and the rest of the UK? It has been explicit in saying that it has no plans to change course, refusing to respect the results of Scottish democracy. That is not policy development and therefore should not be used as an excuse not to provide taxpayer-funded information. Ian, it's an interesting case, I suppose, in one hand, but its importance is greater than its interest, because this is yet another example of attempting to find the biggest carpet they can in order to sweep as much underneath it. It pales into insignificant the last time somebody tried to bury bad news during a bad news day for somebody else, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and hats off to Tommy, because he's been consistent in going after this, and thank goodness that he has done. What on earth are they frightened of? And let's remember, Donald, this is public money. This is our money. This is information that deserves to be in the public domain. And the fact is, they are now wasting even more taxpayers' funds on fighting a ridiculous court case. It makes no sense. It almost feels like an episode of Yes, Prime Minister, doesn't it? It's just absolutely shocking, and it really just shows the lengths that the Tory government are prepared to go to keep us in the dark, to deny the rights of those of us in Scotland to find out the information that they have on their own polling on let's call it, in this case, the case for the union.
Indeed, and we go from trying to keep us in the dark to energy and trying to keep lights on, as the Scottish Government Energy Secretary is in Germany to promote Scotland's hydrogen sector. Speaking there tomorrow, Scotland's Government Energy Secretary Neil Gray will tell sector leaders at the Hydrogen Technology Expo Europe in Bremen that Scotland is well placed to become a major exporter of hydrogen to Europe. Mr Gray and a number of Scottish businesses are joining industry representatives to discuss emerging technologies and potential business opportunities. The Cabinet Secretary's two-day programme also includes a series of engagements in Berlin, which will include the signing of a joint declaration of intent on hydrogen between the UK and Germany. Mr Gray said, "Hydrogen has an important role to play in delivering a net zero economy and creating good, green jobs for our highly skilled workforce, and it is clear that Scotland has the resources, the people and the ambition to become a world leader in hydrogen production, with an ambition of generating 5 gigawatts of renewable and low carbon hydrogen by 2030 and 25 gigawatts by 2045. Scotland has the potential to fulfil some of Germany's long-term hydrogen import requirements." At Holyrood today, the Scottish Parliament backed a Scottish Government motion on the climate emergency, ambition and action, which stated that the Parliament reaffirms its commitment to tackling the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. The motion also regretted the unilateral reversal of policies the UK Government on 20 September 2023 and urged the UK Government to rethink an unforgivable betrayal of current and future generations. Yet again, Ian, we're back at that whole thing of what kind of society we want to not only live in but leave behind here. And you were talking earlier on about our world-leading progress in green energy, and here it is where we're in the centre of Europe. Heaven forfend that anybody would allow us to get back there, eh? But it's an opportunity for us to show our credentials.
Of course it is, and hats off to Neil and the work he's doing. I actually work pretty closely with Neil in my capacity as the SNP's business ambassador. And, I think, let me refer to a couple of things that I've done in this space, actually, if I may, Donald, because just about a year ago, on behalf of the Westminster Group, I published the Skilling Report. And in that report, David, economist based in the Netherlands, painted a picture of the opportunity for Scotland to increase its green energy output fivefold. At that point, we were producing about 12 gigawatts of green energy. We'd increase that up to about 80 by 2050, a massive increase. And much of that potential will feed that supply chain for hydrogen that you've just been talking about, that Neil's engaged in conversations. What an opportunity for Scotland to be a green energy powerhouse. And I'll tell you what's interesting out of that report, Donald, is that it signifies that the potential for jobs by 2050 is about 325,000. So dwarfing the jobs that we have today in oil and gas. Now, I'm not for 1 minute underestimating the scale and the challenge of a just transition, nor does the Scottish Government. We have to manage that. But my goodness, the potential is enormous. And, I can think of one of the things Neil did quite recently, heading out to Japan and being able to secure that investment with Sumitomo, that are going to be building a cable manufacturing facility in the Highlands. But, when you think about what's happening in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, you think about the investment that the European Union is putting in, there is a window of opportunity for us at the moment to get investments in that green energy space, but we're not helped by the lack of action in Westminster. And, there's some specific niches where we've got enormous opportunities as well. Areas such as tidal, for example, where we are the world leader, but we need to support the growth of that industry. And actually, by the way, people often talk about baseload. Some people in the south talk about the need for nuclear. Well, actually, we don't need nuclear, because in our case, tidal would provide the base load that we need, not just for Scotland, but right across the UK. And ultimately, we can do that cheaper than would be the case with nuclear. So you've got some wrong-headed thinking takes place, and a lack of understanding that we need to get on and do this. In July, I published another report mapping Scotland's industrial strategy together with Professor Dominic Holder and Sir Martin Donnelly. And we've had some very fruitful discussions with Scottish Government. Some of the recommendations that we've put in are already in the programme for government. But one of the things I'm really looking forward to our government doing is seizing the opportunity and showing leadership, bringing industry people round the table, recognising that we need to have a forum where we can have business leaders, trade union leaders, academics, making sure that we join up this whole thing and really drive forward that investment into green energy, so we're ready for the future. And when I talk about, the reason I mentioned academia is really twofold. One is we need that link between universities and colleges. We're delivering people with the right kind of skills, but we also need to think about the businesses for the next generation, startups, spin-outs from universities, so on and so forth. So we need a kind of joined up an industrial plan, if you like, that really allows Scotland to power ahead, to drive up its economic growth. Come back to what I was saying earlier, delivering the tax receipts that allows us to invest in health, education, infrastructure, transport, and so much more.
And that, I suppose, it also is the strength that we have. And, the independence movement has had a little bit of a tough time of it. But when you start to delve into it's not a one-person band by any stretch of the imagination. So there's academia involved, there's the opportunity of Westminster with the SNP group working alongside the Scottish Government, and not an expectation that the Scottish Government are simply going to accept anything that's said wholesale, but a debate and a discussion and a move forward. When you see quite literally the peddling back in Westminster under the Conservative government, it's very difficult to understand why it is that people would continue to support what's happening down in Westminster.
Can I give you one interesting statistic? And some people may have heard me say this before. There's a book that was published just a few short years ago by a chap called Anderson called Scotland's Populations. And in that book, Donald, it shows that in every single decade since 1850, Scotland's relative population in the UK has declined. Now, this is not about blaming anyone, but it's about the harsh facts of life, that we've missed out on potential economic opportunity because we haven't had the control of the levers of power. And it's about making sure that we can make this country the success that we know that it can be, that so many other small countries have shown over the course of the last few decades. But we need to change the record, and that comes back to the vision that I've talked about, showing how we can grow the economy, creating better life chances for people. We can't carry on with the status quo, because what's happening with the UK, particularly a relatively isolationist UK outside of Europe, is that the UK is in relative decline. We can exit that, we can change that, but we have to be bold.
Indeed, and more news today in terms of green energy and green investment is the growth of renewable energy and green investment is giving hope to meet the 1.5 degree centigrade target. The prospects of the world staying within that limit on global heating have brightened owing to the staggering growth of renewable energy and green investment in the past 2 years. Fatih Birol, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, has said. Fatih Birol, the world's foremost energy economist, has said much more needed to be done, but the rapid uptake of solar power and electric vehicles were encouraging. They went on to say, despite the scale of the challenges, I feel more optimistic than I felt 2 years ago, he was quoted in an interview. Solar, photovoltaic installations and electric vehicle sales are perfectly in line with what we said they should be to on track to reach net zero by 2050 and thus stay within 1.5 degrees centigrade. Clean energy investments in the last 2 years have seen a staggering 40% increase. Birol warned that greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector were still stubbornly high and that the extreme weather seen around the world this year had shown the climate was already changing at what he called frightening speed. The IEA, in a report entitled Net Zero Roadmap, published this morning, also called on developed countries with 2050 net zero targets, including the United Kingdom, to bring them forward by several years. The report said that almost all countries must bring forward their targeted net zero dates, which for most developed countries are 2050. Some developed countries have earlier dates, such as Germany at 2045 and Austria and Iceland with 2040. However, for many developing countries, they are much later, 2060 in the case of China and 2070 for India. Birol said that COP28, the UN climate summit to be held in Dubai this November and December, offers a key opportunity for countries to set out tougher emissions cutting plans. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak last week reversed and delayed some key policies that would have helped to achieve the UK's 2050 net zero goal. Sunak is also planning a large new round of North Sea oil and gas licences, despite clear advice from the IEA that no upstream oil or gas project should be built on the road to net zero. Birol refused to single out any countries, but made it clear that the richest countries should be moving much faster on renewable energy, energy efficiency, reducing fossil fuel use, and bringing forward their net zero targets. Ian, you mentioned that the UK were sitting in a kind of an isolationist place outside of Europe. It seems that Sunak wants us to be isolationists outside of almost every international body that he can find. This is quite an astonishing thing, that if we're on the way, should we not just keep in the path instead of running away from it because they're feared or fret that somebody might vote against them?
Well, it's the culture wars, isn't it? And it's just staggering, really, that, just listen to what you were saying there about the progress that's been made and the progress that has to be made. And when we're talking about Scotland, we're talking about the UK, there's two big priorities: decarbonising transport and decarbonising heating. And in both these areas, Sunak has taken his foot off the pedal. He's signalling to people that they don't need to do this in the short to medium term. It's quite stunning, the imagery of those messages. And what are you trying to say to people that are investing in new technologies? Because you've decreased the impetus to want to do this. There's a stunning lack of leadership, and he's rightly been condemned roundly over the course of the last few days for this. It's just absolutely shocking. I mean, it's obvious if we are serious about driving up the use of electric vehicles that there is more work that needs to be done. More work needs to be done on battery technologies, on making sure we've got the supply chains in place, of course, and more needs to be done put the physical infrastructure in place. And if I may say so, we've talked about the increase in Scotland's green energy production, but we need to make sure the transmission network's fit for purpose for that to happen as well. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the transmission lines. But of course, in that energy-rich Scotland, we also need to remember that so many people are struggling today with high energy costs because we've got a broken UK energy market that fixes the price for energy based on the wholesale gas market, something that we are self-sufficient in Scotland. And when we're ramping up that cheaper production of green energy, our people should not be being punished by the failures of UK policy. And what we've had is more of the same from Sunak last week, really making the wrong political choices.
Indeed, we've referred to Rishi Sunak's decision making over the last few weeks. Further evidence that by him taking his foot off the pedal, that there are clear implications which are not taking us in a positive pathway, as analysts have reported that UK electric car sales risk falling further behind after Sunak's U-turn. The UK has fallen well behind the rest of Europe in the growth of electric vehicle sales and risks falling further back after Sunak's screeching U-turn on its climate policies, according to industry analysts. UK sales of electric vehicles grew by 31% in the 12 months to July, one of the slowest rates of growth in Europe, according to data analysed by Cornwall Insight and a law firm Shoesmiths. The research revealed the UK's electrical vehicle growth rate fell well behind the near 61% increase in sales across the 27 European Union nations. The report blamed a lack of public charging infrastructure in the UK and warned that the government's decision to delay a ban on the sale of new combustion engine vehicles could shake investor confidence. The Prime Minister announced plans to push back the ban on new fossil fuel vehicles from 2030 until 2035 as part of a significant watering down of the UK government's key climate policies designed to help Britain become net zero by 2050. The unexpected U-turn has led to confusion among car makers and electrical vehicle infrastructure investors by raising uncertainty over how soon drivers in the UK will make the switch to electric options. This could further delay expansion of charging networks, according to the report. The analysis found the UK now has 11.3 electric vehicles for every publicly accessible charge point, leading to range anxiety for drivers considering buying an electric vehicle for longer journeys. In the Netherlands, there is 2.8 electric vehicles for each public charge point, while Sweden and Germany have 8.4 and 12.8 respectively, according to the data for Shoesmith's Electrical Vehicle Country Attractiveness Index. The index found Norway was the most attractive country in which to invest in electric vehicles, followed by the Netherlands, France and Germany. The UK ranked 8th in the league table of 15 nations, down 2 places from last year. Jamie Moll, a research analyst at Cornwall Insight, said the challenges to the UK's electrical vehicle rollout risked being compounded by Sunak's decision to delay the ban on sales of new combustion engine vehicles. Ian, one of the most surprising things I think for most people once Sunak had announced his U-turn was the number of car manufacturers and businesses who condemned it.
Yeah.
When you would have thought that they would be the ones who were right behind it.
No, because, I think for many of the manufacturers, I guess they've had to go through a difficult process because they've had to think about the obligation that they have. And so many of them are now tooling up their production processes to be ready for that increase in demand for electrical vehicles, and they've just had the rug pulled from under them. When you're talking about development of cars, then you're talking about multi-year projects. And so in a sense, when people are investing in these cases hundreds of millions of pounds, to find that the market that they'd been promised would be there by the UK government is not going to be there is absolutely quite shocking. And it does run the risk that we fall behind other countries. The messaging is just all wrong from all of this. But, I think in your piece, I would agree with everything that you said in the analysis that was there from Cornwall. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of work to do to make sure that we've got the the range of these batteries to allow people to have confidence that you don't have that anxiety about not being able to get to a charging point to increase the capacity of the vehicle. And if I think about the Highlands, for example, the distances that people have to travel. I mean, take myself. I mean, getting down to Westminster every week, it's 135 miles to Inverness Airport. So you're really talking about having to have confidence in vehicles to be able to do that. And we need the investment to go into the industry to drive the capability that will give us the confidence to buy these vehicles. And the Tory government's just kicked the confidence away from that with their announcement of last week.
And we go from anxiety in getting your car to a charging point to increasing anxiety if you're looking for a safe haven, as Suella Braverman has attacked the UN Refugee Convention. Being accused of dog whistling politics by Andrew Boff, a Conservative Labour London Assembly member and senior patron of LGBT plus Conservatives, before a speech in which Braverman will say that Britain should not grant asylum to people who simply express a fear of discrimination for being gay. In a speech to the American Enterprise Institute, a right-wing US think tank in Washington, Braverman will argue that the UN's 1951 Refugee Convention must be reformed to tackle a worldwide migration crisis. Braverman is arguing that case law arising from the convention has lowered the threshold so that asylum seekers need only prove that they face discrimination instead of a real risk of torture, death or violence. Responding to the Braverman speech, the Rainbow Migration Charity said, "The government's own statistics suggest that only 2% of all asylum claims in 2022 included sexual orientation as a reason for needing protection. It is already the case that LGBTQI+ people must face a well-founded fear of persecution to qualify for refugee protection in the UK." Commenting, the SNP's Justice and Immigration spokesperson, Chris Stevens MP, said, "The Home Secretary's comments today are deeply ignorant and offensive, proving once again that she is unfit for office. She must retract her comments and issue an urgent apology. Our immigration system should welcome with open arms women or LGBT+ people who are fleeing war-torn countries or places where they face persecution. Instead, the Tories and the Labour Party are too concerned with their obsession of deporting and dehumanising refugees. Instead of attacking the rights of refugees, the Home Secretary should be addressing the real issues in the asylum system, such as the record backlog, providing safe routes for those in need of protection, including refugee visas, resettlement and family reunion schemes. While Scotland remains under the control of a cruel Westminster immigration system, refugees and asylum seekers in our communities will continue to face hardship and anxiety. The only way to guarantee that Scotland's immigration system is based on the values of fairness and dignity is with the full powers of an independent country." Ian, I was sitting discussing with my gay stepdaughter last night where she was wanting to go for a holiday. And there were a number of destinations she was instantly knocking out of the options because she would feel unsafe going there. To then flip that on its side and basically say, unless you're going to be murdered, tortured, or violently attacked, you're not really in fear of anything, is another level of perversity Suella Braverman has managed to delve deep into.
Yeah, she's gone to the States, and I think the speech is almost Trump-esque, isn't it? It's the sort of thing we'd get from the Donald. It's really quite staggering, and you wonder if this is a prelude to the UK leaving the convention, as this is what this is all about. And Chris Stevens, in his comment, absolutely correct. She should be accepting responsibility for the shambles of not being able to process asylum seekers. That's the task in hand for her. But that historic welcome that we have had for people that need sanctuary, that come here, the dehumanisation that is taking place. Why is it the case, for example, that those that are asylum seekers that come here with skills, let's not forget that, could be a credit to the country that they're here. They should be given rights to work while they go through the process that they are. They should have the ability to earn money for themselves and their family. What we have is a whole process which completely dehumanises people. It's not done in our name, and it absolutely shames us to see people like Suella Braverman behaving the way that she has done.
Indeed, and just to be clear, Ian was referring to the other Donald, not this one. And we
Well,
move on to international issues as Zimbabwean opposition politicians being detained after a disputed election. This is following elections in Zimbabwe last month. A number of opposition politicians and activists have been arrested and charged with various offences since President Emerson Mnangagwa won a second term in the 23rd of August vote, a result the Citizens Coalition for Change, the CCC, described as a gigantic fraud. Instead of taking his place in Parliament, CCC opposition MP Gift Siziba has found himself in police custody, facing several charges including inciting violence at a football match and defacing posters of an opponent in Bulawayo. Wambareshi Nyende, a newly elected local councillor from a Harare suburb, was allegedly abducted, tortured and dumped naked near a river earlier this month, according to human rights groups. His lawyer said Nyende and an unnamed relative were also injected with an unknown substance during the brief disappearance. Nyende is reported to have fled the country since the attack. Nyende's lawyer, Doug Coulthart, was also detained, then freed on bail. Coulthart described the two developments as a worrying indication of the state of the rule of law in Zimbabwe and the direction that this regime is going in the 5 years ahead. The opposition MP, Maureen Kadamonga, spent her night in police cells, having been charged with attempted murder and malicious damage to property, only to be cleared of wrongdoing after prosecutors failed to present evidence in court. And Kudzai Kadzombe, a CCC politician and deputy mayor in Harare, was arrested for allegedly assaulting a member of the ruling ZANU-PF party before the election. She is currently out on bail. The CCC says the cases have been brought to intimidate it after last month's disputed election. The crackdown has also drawn criticism from rights groups. We are concerned about the crackdown that we continue to see in the aftermath of the election, said Wilbert Mandinde, the acting executive director of the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, which is a coalition of civil society organisations. Critics have long accused ZANU-PF, in power since independence in 1980, of using the courts to target opposition politicians and to silence dissent. In last month's election, neither of the two main parties secured a two-thirds majority, meaning no wholesale changes can be made to the constitution, including amending the presidential term limits. International observers, including the SADC, a regional bloc that usually endorses polls in member countries, said the election fell short of democratic standards. Ian, Zimbabwe has had a troubled past. Those of us of a certain age remember the joy of Mugabe taking over from Ian Smith and Rhodesia being tossed into the bin, and the hope that came with that. But the following years have not been kind to the population in Zimbabwe, and it would appear that this is something that is continuing.
Yes, I mean, it's just desperately sad, isn't it? And like you, Donald, I do remember the events of 1980. Actually, I do recall at that time, on behalf of my SNP branch, writing a letter of congratulation to Mugabe in becoming president. And I suppose if you contrast the behaviour of Mugabe with that giant of politics and of reconciliation, Nelson Mandela, my goodness, what a difference. And the way that he treated Nkomo, for example, after those elections as well. And we've watched on over the course of the decades as the violence and the corruption that's taking place in that country. And we thought after the departure of Mugabe from the scene that things couldn't get worse, but my goodness, they have done. And I think there is a question for the rest of us in the world. What are we doing to assist those that need help, that need our support? And we must stand up and speak out against these absolutely unspeakable crimes that are taking place. And let's be honest about it. an election once again in Zimbabwe where all the evidence that this is an election that has been stolen. This is not a democratically elected government. This is a despot who is in charge that is intimidating and terrorizing his own people. These are crimes against the people of Zimbabwe.
Indeed, and it's one of the things that the Scottish Government over the last 2 or 3 years, in terms of some form of international aid given or being requested or asked to join in international initiatives, has in a sense shamed the British government by being willing to stand up and speak out and say things and be the first to put their money where their mouth is.
We have a moral responsibility to do that. It comes back to this question about who we are as a people, who we are as a country, and the values that we have. And you stand back from what is happening to ordinary, decent people in Zimbabwe, and the fact that people are being persecuted because they've got the gall of standing up against this terrible regime.
Indeed, and finally tonight we like to end on something that is a bit more good news. Social Security Scotland payments system is helping families access entitlements. And this is families who qualify for Scottish Child Payment, and they are now automatically awarded Best Start Grant Early Learning Payment and School Age Payment when their child becomes eligible, without them having to apply separately. More than 38,000 payments have been paid to families to help with the costs of early learning and starting school. Figures showed that since Social Security Scotland introduced automation of the payments in November last year, 14,825 early learning payments and 23,810 school age payments have been made up to the end of June 2023. Early learning and school age payments are one-off payments of £294.70 to help eligible families as their child grows up with things like clothes, travel, stationery or toys for home learning. Social Security Scotland began making these payments automatically to eligible families who already get Scottish Child Payment, which is £25 per child per week, when it was extended to under 16-year-olds. 1.7 million Best Start Grant and Best Start Food payments have been made, with more than £130 million paid to clients since the benefits launched in 2018. Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice Shirley Ann Somerville said Social Security Scotland's 5 family payments, which includes Best Start Grant Early Learning and School Age payments, are part of a package of measurements taken by the Scottish Government which will help lift 90,000 children out of poverty in Scotland this year. She went on to say tackling child poverty is central to the work of the Scottish Government, and part of that work is making processes as straightforward as they can be for eligible people. The introduction of automatic benefits for some of our payments, for some of our benefits is a crucial part of that. A very small number of people are eligible for early learning and school age payment, but not Scottish Child Payment, and I encourage them to check if they are eligible and continue to apply. Ian, this is always the kind of little things that are done that make a huge difference to ordinary people, and cumulatively together, lots of things that the Scottish Government have been able to do by using their powers to alleviate some of the worst excesses of the alternative, who constantly talk of where are the cuts, where are the efficiencies, where is the language that I can use to make it palatable to hit the head of the poor and make them pay for the mistakes that we've made. And this is just another example.
Yeah, and it's just fantastic what our government's done. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do, we're trying to make sure that we're supporting the most vulnerable young people as they're going through the school system. We know, going back decades, that education is an important route out of poverty, but we need to make sure that people have the resources, they're supported. Everything which is happening through these programs is giving people the tools that they need in order that they can make an impact in their school life, that they can progress to the fullest extent, that we can challenge the attainment gap that we know that we have to do. This is about the Scottish Government being on the right side of those that need our help as they're developing, and thank goodness that we've used our powers through the legislation that we have, through the limited social security powers that we have, to help those that we know, if we help them, that they will go on to make the best impact that they can have as young adults and fully grown adults as part of wider Scottish society.
Indeed, and Ian, thank you for having such a fantastic impact on tonight's programme. It's a delight to have you with us, and thank you very much for joining us.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the programme, and all the best for the programme over the days, weeks and months ahead.
Thank you very much, and as I can see that the sun is setting over in that beautiful part of Scotland that Ian has joined us from, that is it for us this evening. And before I go, I want to just remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much. We've made a commitment that all our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our £30,000 target to pay our bills is still pressing. However, the generosity of our supporters has given us a little bit more time. We have raised now over £17,900 and we're able to continue making programmes for the next few weeks. But we need to raise the remaining £12,100 and it is really urgent. That would give us the tools that we need in order to make more of these kinds of programmes that show you some of the stories that are not getting the attention perhaps from the mainstream media that they deserve from a uniquely Scottish angle. But it's not just this. We have the potential and ability to do so more. So if you can, please do help us by contributing. If you want to volunteer, you want to get involved, please get in contact with us. And if you're on social media, please help us spread our message as far and wide and broad as possible. But from me here, and by the way, if you can afford, it might take me off to geography lessons, because apparently last week I said we're on the south side of Glasgow, and I was stuff. We're in Cucadens, which is the north of Glasgow. So if you want to help us out, even with my Ukrainian pronunciation, please do. But from me, Donald C. Stewart, here in Broadcasting Scotland, it's good night and thank you for watching.